So on today's Lessons in Leadership, we have Joanne Segars. Joanne is a multiple non-exec director and independent trustee. Joanne, it's great to have you on the show today.
Pleased to be with you.
Joanne, I ask everybody the same question to start with because a lot of our listeners are always interested in how people have got to where they are today. So could you give us a quick overview of yourself as an introduction and how you've ended up performing the roles that you do for your current organisations?
Yeah, so currently I'm a trustee and non-executive director, as you've just said. So I chair now pensions. I chair LGPS Central, which manages the assets for 8 local authorities across the Midlands region. I sit on the board of Legal and General, IGC, and I'm also on the board of the CERN Pension Fund. So they're quite a sort of mixed bag of portfolio roles, which I really enjoy, and I'm sure we'll touch on in the course of our conversation. And I come to that really after a long career as an executive. Most recently as the chief executive of the NAPF, or PLSA as it now is, and prior to that working for a number of trade associations. But I suppose my career really started off in pensions, working for the trade union movement as their pensions officer, which I did for 13 years, which gave me a really fabulous grounding in pensions. But also I think, a lot of the skills that I learned bringing into my current roles around dealing with people, diplomacy, getting things done, and working in difficult situations, and dealing with people from diverse backgrounds and with diverse views. And, I came to pensions like an awful lot of people. So I'm sure you've spoken to, Paul, sort of by accident. I finished my master's degree, had a bank overdraft, and the first job that came along was working in pensions, which I thought at the tender age of 22 or 23, which feels like a lifetime ago now. Didn't really want to do that, but 900 years later, here I still am, and it's as fascinating as it ever was.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned there that sort of move from executive to non-executive, and a lot of the people we speak to often want to make that same transition, and they often ask us, what's the best way to do it? How do you go about doing it? How did you go about managing that transition? And what were some of the sort of things you learned along the way of doing that?
Well, I suppose for me, there are 2 things really. First of all, I'd done a number of extra job or sort of jobs alongside my core executive jobs, sitting on boards. So there might have been boards of government reviews or chairing Pensions Europe, for example, when I was heading up the PLSA. And so that gave me some experience of being a non-executive and being on boards of external organisations. I'd also been on the board of the regulator, sort of the predecessor to the current regulator, Opera, for 9 years. And so that gave me some board experience. And then I'd sort of made the decision that I wanted ultimately to become a non-executive director. And I think it's probably always difficult, particularly if you're in a job that you really enjoy and you've got, a reasonable income to make that step, if you like, because it is quite a big step to step out of the security of an executive role into a non-executive role where you need to build up a portfolio, where the remuneration may not be so high, and where you're on a series of rolling fixed term contracts. And for me, I had a health issue that gave me some time to sort of reevaluate what I wanted to do, and it sort of in a way forced me, or forced my decisions to make that step. It was that sort of, right, given what's happened, this is now the right moment to take that step into being a non-executive. But I think I did that having built up some experience of being on board. So I think what I'd suggest to people is, if they do have the opportunity to sit on some boards whilst they're doing some of their non-executive work, and you must see this in the role that you do, Paul, as recruiting into those roles, that I think is really valuable experience. And it gives you, just that experience of observing how boards work and how decisions get made in organisations that aren't your own, because they can be very, very different. And I think one of the things I really enjoy doing the work I'm doing at the moment is actually seeing the differences in organisations, organisational culture, organisational decision-making processes, and those sorts of issues. And then, you can bring all of those differences into, and all those different experiences into how you then work and lead, and that's really fascinating.
Absolutely. It's the number one piece of advice I give people as well when they say they want to transition to become a non-exec director, is at least a couple of years before you want to do that, start working on some boards, whether that be voluntary, whether that be paid work, but try and make that transition early so that you get used to working as a non-executive director, because people are always cautious of hiring first-time non-exec directors because it takes a little while to get up to speed. But also so that you've got that experience and understand the difference of the role, because a lot of people tend to go into exec mode and say, oh, we'll do it like this, rather than asking questions and doing a full governance role as a non-exec director should.
And you're right, it's very, very different. So, just sitting on a board and watching how they operate, watching the dynamics, and it's different for every board, but just watching the dynamics of how a board operates is really, really useful. And I think, going from none of that experience into that world is very, very different. And I think the other thing is remembering that you are a non-executive director and not an executive, and that stepping back. And I think that's something which, everyone, I have other people that I've spoken to have made that step, have that, that's something always quite difficult, and you always have to have that sort of self-denying ordinance to remember that you're a non-executive director, not an executive director.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you touched on in your first answer there around diversity and inclusion, and I know you're very keen to increase diversity and inclusion at board level. I'd be quite interested to hear sort of some of your views and ideas on how organisations can increase diversity and inclusion, and some of the things that you've actually done and implemented with some of the boards you sit on.
Yeah, and I think, there's no really easy answer to that. And one of the things I'm really pleased about is on the board of LGPS Central, from the non-executive directors, it's 75% women. Earlier this year, I was fortunate enough to recruit another brilliant woman to the board of now pensions, Tracy. So, I think, so I'm really pleased about, the women that I work with on different boards. And I think, part of the challenge in recruiting is always, I was very clear when we were going through our last set of recruitments that, I wanted to see women being included in the mix. And so I set the headhunters that we were working with the challenge of making sure that they brought forward some really strong women into the mix, and they did that. So I think it's about being quite demanding and specific about what you want. And that's about making sure that women aren't on the list just to make up the numbers, because, I think I've probably been on a couple of lists on that basis, and it's not a nice place to be. But I think it's also about making sure that there's that sort of pipeline coming through. So making sure that as executives, we're giving women the opportunities to develop as executives within organisations. And then there's those sort of next steps that you were talking about, Paul. So you're making sure that we're giving women the opportunity to build up some of their experience about being on boards outside of their core executive jobs, and that we're giving that support and coaching as it comes through. So LGPS Central, for example, we've joined the Diversity Project to really help build the profile of women in investment management, where the numbers are improving but still not brilliant at women in investment management at senior levels. And so, there aren't any easy answers, but I think it is, and it sounds a bit trite, and it's something which lots of people have said, but it's absolutely true. It is about building up that pipeline, giving that support, and making sure that there are those networks available. Absolutely,
and I think you're right on so many levels there. I mean, one of the points you make there is coming back to our last question around getting that experience and exposing oneself to boards while still in an executive role. And I think that's really vitally important. But there's also the piece there around not being included on a short list or a long list just to make up the numbers, because again, that doesn't help anybody. And I think if you look at the experience that happened in Norway, where the Norwegian government insisted on quotas, what you had was a brain drain of all the females in executive roles taking up non-executive roles, which then left them with no females in the executive roles.
Well, I think that's right, because, and otherwise you end up, and I hope I don't fall into this category of having, the same small number of women on the same boards, and actually the same small number of women from some of the same backgrounds on the same, on a small number of boards. And, we need to remember that diversity goes beyond gender. It's about ethnic background, it's about, class, it's about disability, it's about a whole range of factors. We tend always to focus on gender, and we've still got a long way to go there, but it is about making sure we can look at this across the range of factors, and age is another one. I look at some of the boards that I'm on, and they're all brilliant boards, but we're all people of a certain age, and in some ways that's inevitable because you need a certain amount of experience, and for boards like that are regulated by the FCA or regulated by TPR, that's required. But it does add extra challenges, I think, in that recruitment process, and means you've got to think really hard about what you want, and how you're going to build a board with the mix of skills that you need.
Absolutely. And I always tell the story of, I was working with an investment management firm, and the chair, who was female, asked me to recruit, and they wanted diversity on the shortlist, and their preference was to appoint a candidate which was very different to the rest of the board, given it was 75% white male of all over the age of 55, and they wanted to bring diversity to the board. And they then proceeded to give me a list of really technical criteria, which by the end of it, I just said, well, you're not going to get any diversity because there's only one woman in the whole country which matches this. And I know for a fact she's not interested because I had lunch with her last week. So it's more a case of you've sometimes got to take a little backward step and say, well, what are the key skills that we really, really need to allow that discussion around diversity and bringing in candidates who've got very good backgrounds, very good skill sets, but don't necessarily tick all of the technical requirements. And
it's about the balance, isn't it? So to get your diverse candidate in one person is, one could argue, is slightly tokenistic. Where and if the rest of your board are white men of a certain age, then it's quite tokenistic. One could argue. So it's about making sure that there's a mix of skills and preferences and all those sorts of things, decision-making styles across your board. But bearing in mind that your board has still got a job to do, and it's still got to deliver, and it's still got to run to the highest possible standards of good governance.
Absolutely. So just moving on from diversity then, what would you say have been the sort of real key leadership lessons you've learned throughout your career?
I mean, I think for me, it's probably about setting, a very clear direction and strategy, and making sure that people are brought into that direction and strategy, and that everyone understands what it is. And I think that everybody can see it and see what their part is in delivering that strategy. So no matter where you are in the organisation, you can see what your part is in delivering that strategy. So that might be about having clear objectives for everybody. So objectives that start with the leadership team in an organisation, the chief exec, the executive directors, and then flow down, sort of cascade down through the organisation, so everybody can see what their role is and where they fit into that broader story. And I think it's also about making sure you listen to what people have got to say, making sure that you manage people's expectations, manage and listen to what people are saying to you, but also listen to outside voices. So one of the things that I think organisations can get real value from are perceptions audits, because what you think of yourself, and often that can be quite self-reinforcing, but actually asking other people what they think of your organisation can reveal some interesting points. It might confirm what you already think or know about yourself, but it might also give you some real insight. So I think they can be quite useful factors too.
Absolutely. And I always found that's quite interesting around culture, because organizations often say, well, this is what our culture is. But actually, if you do a perception report, it can be quite different.
Quite different, yeah.
And I think there was a Harvard Business Review article a couple of years ago, which I read, and the famous quote is, well, culture is what your employees tell you it is, not what you necessarily think it is.
Yeah, and I think it's always good to sort of challenge yourself around what you say you stand for and whether other people actually see that as an organisation. So that challenge and that constant asking yourself the question, whether it's a sort of formal perceptions audit or client surveys or whatever it might be, are quite useful exercises, and then seeing what your peers think of you.
Mm-hmm. Which actually brings me nicely about evaluation of yourself as a leader. So how do you evaluate yourself? And I guess off the back of that, how do you know when your own leadership is becoming less effective?
I think difficult questions. I mean, I suppose in terms of the last part of that question, how do I know when my leadership is becoming less effective? It might be when I'm tired. My husband might say it's when I'm irritable. I'm sure I'm never really irritable, but I'm sure he might say that. And I suppose it might be where I do end up stepping in and doing things myself, which I would prefer not to do or shouldn't really be doing. And that might be because time is running out and things just need to be done. In terms of evaluating myself, it's probably something I don't do is in a disciplined a fashion as I should. I'm currently doing a photography course, and one of the things I have to do there after I've done these kind of big projects is do a little sort of self-evaluation. I was thinking just the other day, they happen in a very sort of disciplined and quite mechanistic way, and that may not be quite appropriate, but thinking about that in a slightly more disciplined way might be quite useful. But I suppose I do always look back after a big project and think, well, what went well, and how might I have done things differently if I had the opportunity to do that again. But I'm probably not as disciplined as I might be, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. And some of it's just about asking other people how they've evaluated my contribution to something.
I think it is quite difficult to do self-evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, and we do, for the boards central, for example. Now, we have regular evaluation, annual evaluations, as we do on the other boards too, and that will include a self-evaluation process. So that's a sort of formal part of the evaluation exercise on an annual basis, but on a sort of going through the year, stepping back and just thinking, what could I have done better? Or what could I have done differently? What went well is something which is always useful to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me personally, I've always looked at the end of projects and at the end of the year and looked at what worked, what didn't work, what could I do better, and that's how I've always kind of gone through it in my own mind.
Yeah, and so I'll do that sort of as a sort of mental exercise, but I don't then sort of write down my notes, which I perhaps could do.
Yeah, well, I remember doing my MBA, and critical self-reflection was part of it. You had to write an essay about what you reflect, and I found that quite an interesting process to look at oneself quite so analytically.
Yeah, well, I've got to do something very similar tonight, but that's based on a photography project I've just done. Slightly different, but interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. When things get tough, when deadlines got to be met, etc., how do you keep yourself going, and how do you know when to take a break and balance that sort of work life piece that so many of us get wrong as executives and non-executive directors?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because you know, if you've got deadlines, you know, in the world that we exist in, you know, deadlines might be set by regulators. There are fixed points in the calendar that you absolutely have to meet. They can't be missed. So in a way, you know, you've got to just keep on going. And I think one of the things that probably keeps me going is a belief in what I'm doing. And that's, you know, around doing the best for members, doing the best for savers, doing the best for our clients and shareholders at Central. So it is that desire to keep on going and doing the best for them. And I think, you know, personally, one of the ways I balance out the need to stop and to get some of that work-life balance is through photography. And you can probably see my random collection of cameras and photography paraphernalia behind me. And I've signed up to do some courses to give me very specific points at which, you know, every other Saturday I have to go to class, and therefore that's an absolute break. And because it's using a completely different side of my brain, it really means that I switch off from work, and that I find quite refreshing. Although probably many of my colleagues and friends are bored of me talking to them about photography. But it is a way of just getting that work-life balance. And one of the ways I've done it is by sort of deliberately sort of programming in things to do so that, you know, it forces you to get some more of that work-life balance.
And as a non-executive director, how did you cope with the whole COVID pandemic and moving from face-to-face meetings to online meetings, and what have been some of the sort of benefits you've found from that arrangement, and also what have been some of the negatives of the situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be really interesting how we look back at the last 2 years, 18 months, you know, in 3 or 4 years' time, how we'll look back on that. I think, you know, some of the benefits have been around the ability to convene people more quickly, and that's been helpful. And certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, for a number of the boards, we were having weekly meetings because nobody really quite knew what was going to happen, and we needed to make sure that staff were safe, that suppliers were safe, that the business was continuing as usual, and that there were going to be no bumps along the road. And that ability to jump onto a Teams meeting, jump onto a Zoom meeting, and just get people together quickly was quite helpful. But I think, and you know, certainly again at the beginning, I think many of the boards I was on, and probably other boards too, were took a much more disciplined or slimmed down approach to business, and had, you know, shorter board meetings and so on. But clearly, as this has become the new normal, things have normalised in terms of the length of agendas and the like. So I think it's probably more difficult to maintain momentum if we're meeting virtually. And I think one of the things I really miss is the personal connection, because, you know, there's no substitute for having a meeting physically, having a chat to somebody over coffee, or meeting just ahead of the meeting. And it's much more difficult, clearly, to read body language over a Teams meeting or over a Zoom meeting. And particularly, you know, with my setup on Teams, I can only see 9 people at a time, and you can't actually see everybody in the room. And that can feel a little bit exclusive if you're saying to half the people in the room, well, can you please switch your cameras off? Because you're using up too much bandwidth. So it can feel a little bit exclusive at times. And so, you know, for me, I think the missing that personal connection, and missing the sort of little side conversations, little bits, little vignettes that really make a meeting flow is one of the things I've missed. And I think it's actually much more difficult, and all the chairs I speak to say this, is much more difficult to run a meeting in this sort of format, because you've got to look for hands going up, you've got to look for conversations in the sidebar, and dealing with bandwidth issues and the sort of login issues that we all face. So it's much more tiring, I think, doing that. And I've really noticed that, because in a couple of cases we've actually gone back to having in real life meetings, and they've actually had a very different feel to them than the meetings we've had online. So they've all worked, we've got, for all the boards we've done, this is a testament to not only my fellow board colleagues, but actually the executives. Things have progressed, nothing's fallen over, there's been huge progress made across the piece, and I think that's just an absolute testament to the dedication of the execs working in the business every single day. And it's been remarkable. And I suspect if we'd have been having this conversation 2 years ago, Paul, and you put to me a what if question around this, what if suddenly we all had to go and work remotely, I suspect you and I would have reached the conclusion that it just wasn't tenable. But actually it has been, not just the organisations I'm involved with, but lots of organisations up and down the country. And I think that's been, remarkable.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the level, you're operating at, it's been relatively easy for people to adapt. I think one of the bigger challenges for many organisations has been more junior staff, and how do they work effectively in a remote environment where they might not necessarily have the perfect environment to work from, from their kitchen table or whatever, whilst the kids are running around. I think that's where the challenges have been.
I think that's right. And I think, certainly for boards, as conversations have progressed over the last few months around bringing people back into the office and the public health issues and the health concerns around that versus having people still working at home, those conversations have been very finely balanced, because of course there are some people who are perfectly happy working at home, and people like me have got their own offices, and that's all been great, and others who don't have that luxury, and younger workers, people have just been recruited, people are just starting out in their careers, who really value being around other workers and really learning from being in the workforce and learning from their colleagues. I was talking to one of the young women we've got working for us in LGPS Central, who started, she's been there for about 18 months now, I think, and who came in kind of through our graduate programme. And she was saying to me, I'm really enjoying being back in the office, because for me, at my point, the point I am in my career, it's just brilliant to be around other people and learning from other people. So it's been, quite a fine balancing act, the thought processes around bringing people back into the office.
It's really fascinating, because obviously there's a whole piece around learning via osmosis. You learn from your colleagues who are around you, and if you can't hear their conversations, you can't just go over and ask them a question or pick their brain. Suddenly you lose a lot of that knowledge sharing that you would definitely get within that type of environment.
And I think we probably underestimate and it's a bit like I was saying about, online meetings versus in-person meetings. It's just that sort of soft skill, that sort of noise, and I mean that in a sort of virtual, metaphorical sense, that sits around being in the office, that, you and I have just been used to through all our careers. But, think about a company like LGPS Central. We only went live in April 2018. We've spent pretty well as much of our existence in lockdown as we have not in lockdown. And that's quite remarkable for, when that was mentioned to me a couple of months ago, it really gave me pause for thought, because you think, it's quite remarkable how we've grown up in that sort of environment.
Yeah, I think one of the other interesting pieces which we've learned through the pandemic from our clients is turnover of staff at a junior level has typically been higher. And I was speaking to one COO last week, and she was telling me that their turnover rate is up quite a bit for the last 12, 18 months. So, but interestingly, when we start to look into that and drill down into who's actually left and why they've left, it's been individuals who typically have joined them during the pandemic, and have never been to the office and never met their teammates in real life. They've met them obviously via Zoom and via Teams, but they've never met them in person, and they don't get the culture of the organization, and they don't get the processes, and they found it very difficult when they've then come into that environment.
Yeah, and I think it is, I think it is really, really difficult, because you can learn stuff. You can learn, who people are. And I can see you today, Paul, from the sort of waist up, and you can learn people's faces, and you can learn how stuff works. But that's not the same as actually being in an organization. You can't possibly get culture, really, or you can't get culture very easily, let me say, through a Zoom meeting or through a Teams meeting. And I think it is therefore quite difficult. So I think it puts challenges on organizations to really think about how they manage that sort of return to the office, not return to work, but it's return to the office environment, and how newer staff members are integrated, and how to start to rebuild that culture, even for people who've been around for a long time, because they won't have seen their colleagues for the best part of 2 years. I was joking with somebody the other day about this, and they were saying, oh yeah, I saw such a body in the work for the first time, and I hadn't realised how tall they were, because I'd only actually seen them sitting down for the last year or so. And it is that sort of stuff, again, it comes back to that sort of soft stuff that just makes organisations tick, really. But I think it does put an emphasis on really thinking about, what does that return to the office look like, and how can people be supported into that. And organisations think about that very differently. I think Cardano, which obviously owns Now Pensions, have done that in a really smart way, just thinking about the physical environment that people are working in.
Yeah, absolutely. What's been the sort of biggest leadership crisis you faced, and what did that teach you?
I mean, I think the thing about leadership crises, Paul, if you'll forgive me, is you can't really talk about them very publicly. So I'm going to be very, very general in answering that question, if I may. I think, and I won't be the first person to have said this to you, but, I think some of the big challenges that you get faced as a leader are when you're faced with having to manage somebody out of an organisation, particularly where that organisation isn't a large organisation. It can have reverberations around the organisation. So I think it's about managing that smartly and having a communicating that around to the organisation, but also just managing with sensitivity the person that might be leaving the organisation. So I think there's some of the tough, I'm not going to say they're crises, but there's some of the tough decisions and moments that one has to face in leadership always, and they're never pleasant, and organisations will recover. But I think just making sure that how that's communicated, and then supporting the people who are still there afterwards is some of the lessons that I've learned.
Now, we've all met leaders over the years who we think, wow, they're fabulous and they've got great leadership traits, and I wish I had more of that about me. But we've also met those leaders over the years that we think, wow, I really don't want to be like that individual, which often leads us to certain leadership qualities being overrated. And for you personally, what would you say is the most overrated leadership quality, and why?
I think I'll probably say charisma, by which I really mean style over substance. So you can have a sort of somebody who wow, I'm trying not to name names here, wow, or draw too many parallels, really be exciting and dynamic and all of that kind of stuff, but there isn't really any substance that lies behind it. And I think if you're a bit like that, you probably get found out quite quickly. But I think that's probably something. And I think conversely, I think probably ruthlessness is that sort of, which can often be a mask for bad behaviour. That sort of, Jack Welch, we should fire the bottom 10% every year, and not really think about the consequences of that, or what that means for the organisation and its wider success, and its culture more broadly. So there's probably two there I'd pick out.
And it's interesting. I think the charisma one comes up a lot because to a certain degree you need some of it, but too much of it can be a bad thing.
Well, exactly. And if that's all you've got, then as I say, you're probably going to get found out. But it's not really going to get you very far. You might entertain people, but that you need to have a bit more than that.
Who would you say have been the leaders you've admired most? Now that could be people you've worked with, or it could be historic figures. And why did you admire them as leaders?
I'm probably going to pick out a couple of people that I've worked with and do work with. One of which might surprise you, which is John Monks, who was the General Secretary of the TUC. And John, when he became General Secretary, took a sort of different approach to how he managed the organisation, which was very liberating for people like me growing up there as a sort of young policy officer. And John's broad approach was, well, I'm going to trust you to get on with it, and if you stuff up, then you'll kind of know about it, but I'm going to trust you to get on with it. And I found that quite liberating, and it meant that, partly because I was working in pensions, which at that time wasn't quite so core as it is now to the organisation, it gave me a lot of latitude to do things, which was great for my development. The other person I pick is Laurie Edmonds, who, in addition to being a great friend of mine, is I think somebody who's really inspired me, because he's one of life's brilliant people who is enormously generous with his knowledge, and just by observing Laurie and how he gets things done has been really instructive to me in thinking about how I go about my work. But he's one of life's super generous people with his time and his experience and knowledge. And if I've got something that I'm wrestling with, then I'll often go to Laurie for advice.
Joanne, thank you very much for your time today. It's been great to have you on the show. And I'm sure our listeners and viewers will appreciate your candid thoughts.
Thank you very much.